So my task for this afternoon is to consider the potential for the use of restorative justice in the context of domestic violence, and to think specifically about what it offers those of us who work with people subjected to abuse and what the application of those ideas might look like in practice. In the States, we have a phrase, preaching to the choir. Do you have that phrase here? So, tell me, Judge? Okay, so I feel a little as though I am preaching to the converted today, because so many of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today come straight from the work that you've been doing in New Zealand for years. So I hope that you'll bear with me and recognize that I recognize the debt that we owe to you for the groundbreaking work that's been done here. So just a couple of quick notes about how I came to this work. As I said earlier, I've represented people subjected to abuse, primarily women, for the last 20 years. And as I told you, over that time, I've come to be concerned about the effectiveness of the criminal justice response. For those people who want a retributive response, right, who want a punishment-based response, I think our criminal justice system works quite well in the United States. The system sometimes works when a harm doer is arrested and convicted and sentenced to something that roughly corresponds to what the injured person sees as just, right? So in those circumstances, our system works well. But for many, many people, retributive justice will not meet their goals. For some people, justice comes in other forms, right? And so for some of the clients that I work with, justice is economic. What they need is economic support to be able to deal with the challenges that they're facing. For some people, justice is emotional. They need the opportunity to deal with the emotional wounds that, as Ruth described, are often the most debilitating things that they face. The psychologist Judith Herman has done work where she's surveyed people who've been subjected to abuse and found that what they really want is one of three big things. Voice, and we've talked about voice a little bit today, but the opportunity to be heard, to tell one's story and to be heard. Not something that happens well in the criminal justice system, where stories are mediated by the rules of evidence, the requirements of time, and the constraints of things like cross-examination. Secondly, people want validation. Having told their stories, they want someone to respond to them by saying, "What happened to you was wrong." Again, something that the criminal justice system can't necessarily do, right? A judge can't. There's a great quote about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission where someone said of Desmond Tutu, a judge doesn't cry, but Reverend Tutu cries, right? That's validation, and that's not something a judge can necessarily give. A judge sits in a neutral role and can't provide that kind of validation. And vindication, right? Giving the person what it is that they needed to address their goals in the first place. And again, we can't do that well necessarily in the criminal justice system when what you need is not a remedy that's provided by that system. And we can't necessarily do it in the civil justice system either, for many of the same reasons, although, like the judge, I'm partial to the civil justice system over the criminal justice system. Over the last several years, I've started to think a lot about what justice means to people subjected to abuse. And if you look at the literature, there's not much empirical work on this question. Judith Herman's work is out there. There are a couple of other things kind of here and there. But in the way that we fail to talk to survivors about their experiences, one of the questions we haven't really asked so much is, what does justice mean to you? And how is it that we can help you achieve that? And so in my book, A Troubled Marriage, I shared some initial thoughts about restorative justice, community accountability, and domestic violence, and I want to build on those thoughts here. So first, it might be useful to lay out, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the feminist critique of using restorative justice in cases of intimate partner violence. In his book, Restorative Justice and Violence Against Women, James Potacek broadly organizes these concerns into three. One is about safety, and we've heard a lot about safety so far already today, but the question that women are not safe in the context of restorative justice in the same way that women were not safe in mediation. Because of the power dynamics, because restorative justice practitioners may not have an understanding of those power dynamics or understand how to mitigate them, because of physical safety, and the idea of having two people in the same room is controversial. So lots of concerns about safety. Secondly, there are concerns about offender accountability, and the argument goes like this. Offenders can only be held accountable by being... Anything we should care about? No. Okay. I'm in a place where there are earthquakes and really high winds, and so I need to just check. And, having lived in California, I'm okay with all that. I just want to be clear about what's going on. Okay, so offender accountability, right? The idea is that we can only hold offenders accountable by locking them up. And that is the only way that accountability comes. Otherwise, we're too easy on offenders, and we don't send the strong anti-abuse messages that are necessary to create strong community norms against abuse, right? So by doing things like restorative justice, we're undercutting offender accountability. And third, Ptashek talks about the politics of gender and race. And what he means by this is that by using systems outside of state systems and outside of public systems, and I'll come back to this idea of public later, I think it's a bit misleading. And by the way, these aren't Jim's arguments. This is how Jim categorizes the arguments. I think he'd want me to say that. That we're pushing the problems of women, and particularly women of color, back into the private sphere from whence we rescued them some 40 years ago when we declared that domestic violence was a crime that should be treated like every other crime and addressed by public systems, right? And so we're undercutting the problems of women, and particularly the problems of women of color, by saying they are not worthy of being dealt with by public systems, and that instead they should be addressed in these kind of private realms. In addition, feminists have expressed concern about whether restorative justice is sufficiently victim-centered and whether restorative justice forces forgiveness on women who are not ready to forgive, and whether it creates sufficient spaces for women's justified anger at having been abused. So let me just admit right off the bat that if I had been giving this talk in the early 1990s, I would have said all of those things. I shared all of those concerns, and I would not have been open to talking about alternatives to the criminal justice system. And I have, over time, changed my views about all of these things. But at the time, in the 1990s, when, if you had brought this to me, I would have told you, no, men can't change. They don't change. I had a blinkered conception of men who abused, and I didn't believe that any such process would truly hold them accountable for what they had done. And I had an equally narrow conception of what it was that my clients needed and wanted, largely because I had failed to ask them. So, in my work, though, over the last 20 years, I have seen that the criminal justice system does not necessarily hold men accountable for the harm that they do. Those who abuse often attack their partners repeatedly with minimal sanctions. Most cases in the United States are still prosecuted as misdemeanors, and jail time for intimate partner violence is still pretty rare. And I'll give you an example, although it's a very extreme one from the United States, although as Ruth has just mentioned, sometimes things that sound as extreme aren't necessarily as extreme as they sound. Kenneth Woodruff of Lacombe, Louisiana, was first arrested for domestic violence in 2005. He was convicted of a misdemeanor and sentenced to probation and community service. In 2006, he was convicted of a second misdemeanor and sentenced to probation. In 2008, a plea deal allowed him to plead guilty to a second domestic violence offense, because if he had pled guilty to a third offense, it would have had to have been prosecuted as a felony. And later in 2008, he was again arrested, convicted of felony domestic violence, and sentenced to time served. Do you know what time served is? Yes. The time he'd already been in jail. Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure that I'm communicating well. Oh, well, so we should go watch. I went and watched the other day. It was awesome. It's fantastic. Okay, so in February 2009, he was convicted of another felony, sentenced to a year in jail, given credit for time served. In October of 2009, so note, February to October, though he had been sentenced to a year, he had gotten credit for time served, he was out in October, arrested and convicted for a sixth time, and finally given a significant sentence of 15 years imprisonment, 8 years of which was suspended. So, all of these acts of violence targeted the same woman. Imagine not only having been attacked each of these times, and probably many more, but also having to go through 6 separate criminal proceedings, a process about which psychologist Judith Herman notes, if one set out intentionally to design a system for provoking symptoms of traumatic stress, it might look very much like a court of law. It's hard to see how justice is served in a situation like that, although I can't know. Maybe that 7-year sentence in the end was what that particular victim needed. I can tell you from the experience of my clients. I have a client now whose husband was criminally prosecuted. We have a civil protection order in place for her. We've done her divorce. He violated the protective order, he pled guilty, he did some time in jail, he got out. He violated the protective order, he pled guilty, he did no time in jail. There was a criminal trial for all of the violations that led to the protective order. He was found not guilty by a jury, despite the fact that one of them was about violation of a protective order, and they were placed in the same room. So clearly there was a violation of the protective order. He violated the protective order again, he's back in jail again, and that didn't stop a judge from saying, when you get out of jail, we can discuss your access to the child. So extreme, it's an extreme example, but I don't think it's that far out of the norm, to be honest. So then what? Well, maybe then restorative justice. Restorative justice offers us a radically different way to think about achieving justice for people subjected to abuse. And I want to be very clear, I don't come to this as a restorative justice practitioner. I have never done a conference. I've attended a conference, but not in an intimate partner violence setting. I am not an RJ person. This is not where I come from. So I come to this as a domestic violence person who's interested in looking for alternatives. And I just want to be very clear about that. So, why is it that I believe this? First, I think restorative justice provides us with an alternative to the criminal justice sanctions that we are currently relying upon, in some cases to our detriment, without jettisoning that system altogether. And I agree with everyone who has said, we're not at decriminalization completely yet. The criminal justice system for us is the most developed and best response to domestic violence that we have. Nonetheless, in the domestic violence community in the United States, there's a serious conversation going on about the continued efficacy of criminal justice interventions. In part, it's some of what I talked about this morning. In part, it's because advocates are concerned that the system is doing more harm than good, particularly to our most vulnerable communities: women of color, immigrant women, low-income women, LGBT people, those folks who have the fewest resources to deal with the abuse against them. And Anne Hayden's research on the reporting of intimate partner violence to law enforcement here in New Zealand suggests that you have similar concerns here. So only one of the 8 victims that she interviewed was confident in or satisfied with the criminal justice system's response to domestic violence, and all of them could articulate reasons why you would never report to police. So it's clear that we're all looking for solutions to this particular problem of people's unwillingness to engage with the criminal justice system. But we also know that there are people out there who are so abusive that they must be incapacitated. And I don't think anybody would argue that. So the really difficult question that we face is, how do we draw those lines? How do we figure out when someone's behavior is so abusive or so dangerous that there is no choice but to incarcerate that person? When is it that the state's responsibility for public safety becomes paramount? So in a 1994 article, John Braithwaite and Kathleen Daly used a regulatory pyramid structure to suggest an answer to this question. So you just kind of have to envision the pyramid, right? Responses to intimate partner abuse in this conception would escalate from self-sanctioning at the bottom of the base of the pyramid, right? Most of those things, and social disapproval, through confrontation with family and the threat of incarceration, through 3 levels of community conferencing, to arrest with intensive probation, to imprisonment, right? So only in that subset of cases that are so severe and so ongoing that we actually need the sanction of imprisonment would you use that sanction. You would try to work your way up through the pyramid first. And the idea is to marry kind of the big stick of serious, certain criminal justice intervention with moral suasion, leading people to refrain from committing intimate partner abuse, not because it's a crime, but because it's wrong, and helping people to understand that wrong. So whether the promise of certain and serious criminal sanctions would deter violence in ways that the current system does not is an open question, since the criminal justice system, at least in the United States, is currently used so infrequently and so unsystematically that we don't actually know whether it could deter intimate partner abuse. And that's kind of the argument that I made this morning, right? The counter to everything I said this morning is, you don't really know that the criminal justice system works because we don't really do it. And we don't. I don't think we should, and I've told you why that is, but it's certainly an argument that's out there. Now, my guess is that very few anti-violence advocates would be completely happy with that pyramid. It makes us feel a little bit squirmy, right? All those levels that you got to go through before you ever get to any police intervention. It runs so counter to everything that we've thought about and we've developed and we've advocated for over time. Some will argue that the failure to immediately invoke the power of the state fails to send the message that intimate partner abuse will not be tolerated in our society. Others will be unhappy with the multiple chances that those who abuse get to change their behavior. And still others, and very few others, but I promise you that they exist, at least in the United States, would want incarceration to be taken off the table as an option at all. So there is a small but growing number of voices in the United States around prison abolition, right? And so that in some ways gets to a distinction between, say, criminalization and punishment, right? Should something still be a crime but have a different kind of punishment than incarceration? But for some folks, the idea of incarceration is just anathema, right? That takes us off the table altogether. But I think that that may be a sign that Braithwaite and Daly are onto something, right? A solution that addresses many of the concerns of most of the people but doesn't make anybody completely happy. The bottom line for me is that we're not achieving accountability through the criminal justice system. A system that requires someone, though, to face the person that he has harmed, his partner, his family, his community, may give us the kind of accountability that we've hoped for and actually create meaningful change. If what we mean by accountability is just, I mark that you have done something wrong, we're doing that, right? In some cases, we're doing that. If what we mean by accountability is change, that we mark that you have done something wrong and we demand or ask nicely that you change your behavior, that's something different. And so I think it goes back to this question about what is accountability and how do we define accountability. For me, accountability has to be tied to real change. Second, restorative justice could help us to change community norms around intimate partner abuse, which is something that we've been working towards since the inception of the battered women's movement, and I would say not as successfully as we would have liked. So for us in the United States, for me, it's become most clear in Baltimore recently in the aftermath of the incident with Ray Rice, and I don't know if that got international attention, but so you know that we had a football player who punched out his wife in an elevator, right, knocked her out cold. What was really interesting to watch in that whole progression was the change that happened between the release of the first video and the release of the second video in terms of community norms around violence. After the first video came out, there was still a lot of conversation, right, about, well, she's laying out cold on the floor. He dismissively nudges her with his foot on the way out. He leaves her skirt hiked up around her waist. But he may not have done anything wrong. And I'm telling you, that was the community conversation in Baltimore, right? And you can't underestimate how beloved a figure Ray Rice was. I don't know who the parallel figure would be in the rugby world here, but in Baltimore City, Ray Rice is one of the good guys. He does community work, he does work with children's groups, he does a lot of charity work. People love Ray Rice. They cannot believe that this is someone who could do this. And so after the first video comes out, it's, well, I heard she spit on him, and if she did that, then she deserved what she got. We don't know what happened in that elevator. Yes, maybe she was drunk. Maybe she did this, maybe she did that. But there was no kind of clear condemnation of the abuse. It took the second video coming out where you see him fell her with a punch, right? One punch. Knock her out cold. That then some people said what he did was wrong. Not everybody. So they had Jersey Day, right, at the stadium. The number of Ray Rice jerseys that still appeared at that stadium on that day was striking. Now, I don't think Ray Rice deserves to be tarred and feathered and pilloried for the rest of his life, but if we're talking about community views about violence, it was very clear that for some people, we're still willing to give a pass as a community. So the early battered women's movement believed that passing laws declaring domestic violence a crime would begin to create that kind of cultural change because those laws would serve as a community's assertion of the disapproval of that behavior. But we have those laws, and we've had them for a long time. And community norms haven't shifted nearly as much, I think, as we would want them to. And so I think it's worth asking whether the expressive function of those laws is really doing what we want it to do, and if it's not, what are the other kinds of things that we can do to really change the way that communities view violence? Restorative justice may give us a chance to do that. At least in the United States, the massive buildup of oppressive crime control efforts can be traced in large part to the community's abdication of responsibility to effectively control crime itself. And so this is controversial, and I get that. It's not the community's job to stop all crime. It is the community's job to set norms that says these sorts of things aren't acceptable. It is the community's job to condemn those who commit those kinds of crimes. To abdicate everything to the state means the community is saying, we don't really care about what happens in our communities, and we're not going to self-police people in any way, not through policing, right, but through shaming, through naming, through other kinds of techniques that one might use. And I think that reliance on the state has created a vicious cycle that's made reinvigorating community responses to crime much more difficult. Communities believe that the state is responsible for dealing with intimate partner abuse, and so they defer to the state. The state, and in our case, the private actors who benefit tremendously from assisting the state in incarcerating huge swaths of our population, encourages carceral responses, and communities become further disengaged from the problem. Another vicious cycle. Restorative justice, though, gives the community back a role to play in terms of self-regulation. The notion of community responsibility, married to justice strategies that rely upon and even require community involvement, could reinvigorate community efforts to police abuse and could fundamentally transform how communities understand intimate partner abuse, which could in turn lead to the kind of change around community norms regarding intimate partner abuse that we have long sought. In addition, using the carceral system is simply feeding the beast in some ways. The carceral system models violence, right? It overpowers and controls those who have been accused or convicted of crimes. Using nonviolent forms of justice could help us to change community norms around the acceptability of violence. It just seems wrong, right? We do violence to people and then we say to them, and now you need to come out and be nonviolent. And we expect there to be real change. As John Braithwaite has written, if we want a world with less violence and less dominating abuse of others, we need to take seriously rituals that encourage approval of caring behavior so that citizens will acquire pride in being caring and non-dominating. In the United States, we've lost that. I think we've lost that norm entirely. Restorative justice is a way of bringing that back. Turning to restorative justice could also help us to expand how the community understands abuse. The law's definition of abuse, as we talked about, is quite narrow, but people subjected to abuse experience things that are much broader than that. And to hear Ruth say, the cycle, as horrific as the physical abuse that she experienced was, the psychological damage was what was longer lasting. And when I go to court, I can't do a thing about that. If I go to court with just psychological damage, I have no case, right? So we have to think about creating forums where that kind of abuse is recognized and honored and dealt with. Restorative justice could broaden our community's understandings of abuse by considering claims involving not just abuse that is legally actionable, but also abuse that is legal, but exceedingly harmful. So in conferences, we could discuss the impact of these other forms of abuse on the person subjected to abuse and on that wider circle, on the kids, on the family, on the community's perception of this person. Conference agreements could cover not just physical abuse, but other forms of abuse as well, things that the law won't touch. These conversations could then help to broaden the community's definition of intimate partner abuse and establish community disapproval of such tactics. The criminal justice system might not intervene if these other forms of abuse continue to occur, but if restorative justice works, we might not need it to. I want to say a quick word about community. So this notion that by using restorative justice we'd be reprivatizing domestic violence depends on the idea that these kinds of community-based interventions are private. I disagree. Community is just another form of public, right? It's a different form of public, and it may actually be a more public form of public when you think about kind of how often it is that the public is sitting in courtrooms. In where I am, you're only sitting in the courtroom if you're a witness or a victim. So that's not changing a broader community norm around anything. So engaging communities in these forms of restorative justice may give us a greater outreach. I also want to say a word about what community means. So the big argument that I've heard against restorative justice is the community isn't going to condemn abuse. It doesn't condemn abuse. Well, it depends on how you define community. So most people would define community as geographic community, right? At least in the United States, most people would do that. I think here you'd be much more likely to define it around cultural community. And there are concerns about the patriarchal structures in cultural communities and the ability to make real change within those communities. But we can define community for the purposes of restorative justice however we want. It can be faith community, it can be ethnic community, it can be cultural community, it can be geographic community, it could be online community. I mean, I think that the possibilities for defining community are endless. And then you can start to filter that work out, right? But if we accept that our communities don't condemn abuse now, and therefore they're not any more likely to do that in a restorative setting, I think we've given up before we've even started. For me, it's incredibly important that restorative justice can put power back into the hands of the person who's been subjected to abuse, right? And when I think about how restorative justice should work in cases involving intimate partner violence, I think that it's that person who gets to decide whether the conference takes place. And she gets to decide what supporters are going to be at the table. She gets to tell the story how she wishes without the mediation of legal rules and norms. She can accept or decline an apology. She can ask for the kinds of reparations that will make her whole, instead of having to take whatever it is that the legal system can offer her. Restorative justice is empowering in ways that the criminal justice system, with its restrictions on how and when victims can tell their stories, and its relegation of the victim to a secondary role in the process, as a witness rather than a party, can never be. Restorative justice honors the humanity of both the person subjected to abuse and her partner, and we've already talked about this idea that many people still love their partners, they want to continue their relationships. While they want the abuse to stop, they don't want their partners demonized. And although feminist scholars have argued that, given the state's history of ignoring intimate partner abuse, stigma is an important part of establishing community norms against violence, that kind of shaming and stigmatizing may simply produce more violence if those who are abusing feel that they were not heard or dignified in the process. The corrosive impact of shame has long been recognized. In 1787, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a scholar, politician, and physician in the United States, one of the founders of the United States, wrote that shame was a worse punishment than death. In the context of intimate partner abuse, then shaming has to be reintegrative, moving away from stereotyping and demonizing people who abuse their partners and towards a world where we express disapproval for the act, but hope and trust for the person who commits it, unless and until that person proves continually unworthy of hope and trust. And again, where we draw lines is part of that conversation about how we do this properly. Without using that kind of an approach, people who abuse may curtail some of their violence to avoid further criminal involvement, but they are unlikely to fundamentally change their behavior towards their partners. And I think the research on abuser intervention programs is really instructive here. While some participants in programs decrease their use of physical violence, their verbal and psychological abuse of their partners tends to escalate. The programs and the punishment don't make those who abuse more empathetic. They simply teach them how to abuse without risking further criminal sanctions. Shame and stigma are not going to help us achieve real change. They're not going to help people develop empathy for their victims. They're not going to help people internalize the values of the law. But there are potential dangers here. And one obvious question is whether restorative justice can prompt lasting change. And that goes, again, to this kind of conversation we had earlier about why it is that men are abusive. So we assume that men are abusive because they seek power and control over their partners. But as Ellen Pence, who is the visionary founder of the Duluth Abuse Intervention Project, which has served as a model for community-based intervention in IPV around the world, noted in several interviews actually, we don't actually know why men abuse. We've used their behavior, which serves to exert power and control over people, to justify our theories, without really understanding why they do what they do. So put differently, what she said was, we saw what we thought was there. We saw what we wanted to see. We never asked them why they were doing it. We assumed that because this was the outcome of what they were doing, that was the intention for what they were doing. But intention and outcome can be two very different things. I'm not going to argue that the outcome of domestic violence is power and control. I would never argue that. But I think it's worth exploring whether that's the intention. Because until we understand the intention, we can't really make change. Restorative processes might provide us with greater insight into the motivations of those who abuse. So restorative justice work in the context of intimate partner violence has largely focused on the use of conferencing. But conferencing isn't the only way to bring the principles of restorative justice to families who are experiencing domestic violence. There are, in fact, a continuum of restorative practices that we might be able to offer. So conferences could address intimate partner abuse occurring in the immediate present. But as Susan Miller and Leanne Iavani have recently written, Post-conviction dialogues have been successful in helping people subjected to abuse experience empowerment and voice and validation, and I use empowerment in kind of the good sense of the word, as opposed to the isolating sense of the word. Miller and Iavani stress the importance of timing. The victim needs to be ready to reap the benefits of facing the offender, and the offender must have had time to develop empathy and take responsibility. So that's one option that's out there. I've been thinking a lot about how to create community-based justice forums for people subjected to abuse, using the lessons of truth commissions and community courts like India's Nari Adalats, feminist courts which were designed to help women who could not access formal court systems resolve family issues. Such community-based forums could enable people subjected to abuse to share their stories in their communities, however we choose to define them, in the hopes of achieving that voice and validation and vindication, and with the community empowered to provide some sort of reparations, whether those reparations be material and economic or moral, just giving the person the knowledge that the community stands with them. Community-based forums could also provide spaces where those who abuse, with the consent of their partners, could ask for the community's forgiveness and seek community support and reintegration. Do we know that any of this would work? No. But as criminologist Lawrence Sherman, who did the first studies on mandatory arrest in the United States, pointed out, the bar for success at this point is pretty low. Since there is no evidence, Sherman says, that standard justice is any more effective than doing nothing in response to an incident of domestic violence, the only challenge to restorative justice is to do better than doing nothing. I think we can do that. And there's reason to believe that restorative justice is, in fact, better than doing nothing. In studies done with families in Canada in the context of child protection and intimate partner violence, both victims and offenders were highly satisfied with the restorative processes, and there was no new violence that occurred in those families over the lifetime of that study. The work that's being done in, I'm going to get it wrong, shoot. I'm not even going to say. The work that's being done north of here in a city that begins with an R that I can't pronounce properly, in Rotorua, I think also shows us, right, the potential for the use of restorative justice in intimate partner violence cases. And the work that Project Restore is doing, similar work that's being done in Arizona in the United States by Mary Koss around sexual assault and restorative justice, those are all reasons for us to have hope about the potential for these kinds of processes in cases of intimate partner violence. Are there limitations to this kind of work? Absolutely. Right? The single biggest limitation, I think, is the requirement that an offender take responsibility before engaging in restorative practices. That's going to mean necessarily that many cases involving domestic violence are going to get screened out kind of at jump in the beginning. And I am not suggesting that we skimp on that requirement in any way. As the standards of practice that you have adopted here recognize, the willingness to take responsibility is a central tenet of restorative justice and one that we should not abandon. And so restorative justice is not going to work in those cases, and that's okay. We're not trying to effectuate a wholesale replacement of the criminal justice system. We're trying to figure out ways that we can better serve people whose interests are not served by that system. And it's not going to work for everybody, and that's okay too. Restorative justice is not going to meet the justice goals of some people subjected to abuse. There are some of my clients who more than anything want their partners to go to jail. They think it's important that they are held accountable for what they've done. They want that public acknowledgement, and they want the space, right? Separation does work for some people, and that separation that we can get through incarceration is very important for some of my clients. And so if restorative justice doesn't meet the justice goals of the person subjected to abuse, we shouldn't be using it. Restorative justice is also going to be difficult to scale up, particularly in the United States. I mean, if you think about those 907,000 incidents of intimate partner abuse that I mentioned earlier today, I don't know about you, but I can't quite get my head around how we would do 907,000 conferences, right, and do them right, so that we do the kind of preparatory work with both victims and offenders that has to get done before a conference ever happens, so that we don't think, and I don't think you can do one conference and think you'll have kind of dealt with these issues. It's going to be a process. And it's a process that's going to be very difficult to scale up. But as Judge Chris McGuire points out in the recent book, A Restorative Approach to Family Violence, the Rotorua District Court has achieved critical mass in its work in restorative justice. All of the cases in which restorative justice seems to be a good option are being sent to service providers, and intimate partner violence cases have been about a third of those referrals. So it's worth thinking about how you scale up without saying that because we can't do it immediately, we shouldn't do it at all. The other thing I want to say is that, we've been thinking a lot about kind of who this would work for. And I think there are really three groups of people who it works well for. One, people who want to stay in their relationships and need some help reordering those relationships so that they can go forward safely. And those people may not be interested in seeking out state systems at all, right? Two, we've talked a lot about children. It's not something that I get a lot of time to talk about in the context of my usual talks, but most of the folks that I deal with are co-parenting. It is very, very rare, as in Ruth's situation, for a judge in the United States to say you will never have contact with your child again. And so to some extent, these are people who are going to continue to have contact in some way, whether in the very removed way of having a child come back who's extremely distraught after visitation, or in a much more direct way. I just had a judge impose joint custody on my client in terms of her parenting work, even though he put a protective order in place and found that she had been abused. So for people who are co-parenting, there may be ways to help them negotiate those relationships more safely and effectively through the use of restorative justice. And the third thing is, for people who live in small communities where they're going to have to continue to have some kind of contact, I think restorative justice may be particularly important, because you need that kind of community support to be built in around people as those relationships go forward. And you really need to know that the community is going to come in and provide the kind of safety and security that the victim needs and hold the batterer accountable, right, when he comes back into that community. And so in those kinds of cases, I think restorative justice could do tremendous amounts of good. So I really believe, as a domestic violence person, that there is a role for restorative justice to play in our system. But I think the charge for those of us who understand domestic violence, who care about people subjected to abuse, and who worry about how badly restorative processes can go if they are initiated by those who are not sensitive to the issues around domestic violence and who don't care, quite frankly, or think that because they're restorative practitioners, they can do it without being thoughtful about it. And that's not anyone in this room. It may not be anyone in New Zealand. It's certainly happening in the US. Our job as those people with those concerns and with that expertise is to create, cultivate, and evaluate those practices ourselves. We cannot simply throw up our hands and say, I want nothing to do with this. Have fun with it. Godspeed to you. As these practices evolve, we have to be active participants in change. We've got to make sure that our clients are safeguarded in these processes. And if we want to see, and if you accept, as I do, that what we're doing now isn't working particularly well, we got to try new things. And then we got to figure out whether they work. And then we have to be brave enough to say, we tried it worked, let's continue it. Or we tried it didn't work, let's figure out something else. But we've got to be engaged. I think that's essential. It's essential to our mission for those of us who care about client safety and about achieving justice for our clients. In Restorative Justice and Responsive Regulation, John Braithwaite wrote that the research and development agenda now is to enlarge our understanding of the conditions under which the promise of restorative justice is realized. In the realm of intimate partner violence, we have failed to take up that challenge. The groundbreaking work on the impact of conferencing in cases involving intimate partner violence needs to be replicated by those of us who believe that restorative justice could offer something richer and something more satisfying to people subjected to abuse. Until we do that, people subjected to abuse won't have any option but to seek justice through the justice system or not to seek justice at all.